It's the last week of gin month, and as is tradition in 52 cocktails, the last week of every month is a bit wacky. And although Martini may sound simple on the surface level, this is as wacky as it gets. Ask anyone on the street, any bartender, what is the ideal martini? You are going to get a different answer probably every time. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'll try to go quickly. We are going to build many martinis on camera. I'm not even sure what the count is. This is called 4-lane martini because I'm going to guide you through 4 different styles or categories of martinis, and which within those we may build 1 or 2. The first one is going to be 3 that I have here at the ready. We're going to get into that in a moment. First, maybe I'll say, what is not a martini? Well, there's a lot of cocktails that have the word martini in it, like espresso martini or appletini. Those are just cocktails that are served in a martini glass. I wouldn't classify those as a martini at all. What we're talking about specifically here is the basic makeup of gin. Specifically, dry gin, as we've been playing with all month, and vermouth, specifically dry vermouth, not vermouth rosso or sweet vermouth like we did last week, but dry vermouth. Speaking of dry, this is basically the first part or piece of the conversation here of how to build a proper martini. There is the gamut of preference between what they call a wet martini or a dry martini. Actually, the martini used to be served with Old Toms, and that was a sweeter gin. And then it moved to a London Dry, which was drier, and that is why we order a dry martini. But that was no longer the case. Right now, wet and dry refer to how much vermouth is in this ratio of these 2 ingredients. A wet martini would have more vermouth, which is generally going to be sweeter and a little bit less alcoholic. Vermouth is around 14 to 18%. Gin, as we know, is around 40%, so that's about half the ABV. A dry vermouth is going to be more gin heavy ratio-wise and less vermouth. But before we even get into that, there are people that will order a vodka martini where we're not even using gin. And maybe taking a step back from even there are people that will order a shaken martini. So let's take a step back. Let's take a deep breath. Right now, I'm trying as best as I can today, and also in this course in general, to go to the classics, to go to the traditional sense, the most consensus, either modern day or traditional way of building the drink. Martinis have classically been built with gin. Vodka only came, I believe, in the 1950s, which became popular with James Bond. Asterisk here, more on that in a moment. And generally, it is a stirred drink. In general, it will have a lot more of its profile, a lot more of its nuance and flavor with stirring. Once you shake it, you're disrupting a lot. Not to say that you can't have a vodka martini, not to say that you can't have a shaken martini, but in the classical sense, we're dealing with gin-based and stirred. So, back to that asterisk, why did James Bond order, classically, a vodka martini shaken, not stirred? Well, one theory that I heard, that I resonate with, is he was a spy, right? He was on the job. So when you shake, you are heavily diluting, which equals less alcohol or more water, let's say. So if you're just having little sips of a shaken martini, you are not going to get nearly as influenced by the alcohol as if you were having some sips of a stirred martini. That's a theory that I resonate with. So he specifically asked for shaken because it's not usually shaken, because he didn't want to get drunk on the job. Okay, we are going to build for lane 1 the gamut of, not the entire gamut, but the general gamut of wet to dry. Once again, ask on the street, ask anyone involved what their definition of wet or dry martini, you're gonna get a bunch of different answers, but it can vary from ratios of 1:1 to 1:15. What does that mean? We are gonna go with, we'll say the center one is going to be our classic wet, or we'll make this one classic wet, okay? Classic wet is gonna be 1:1. Now, again, people will say that's crazy, that's way too sweet. It used to be very heavily leaned towards sweet, not only with the Old Tom's gin, but with the amount of vermouth. And classically, 1:1 was how you built a martini. And then fairly recently, in the last, 50 to 70 years, recent in our terms here, we just kept dialing back the wet, the sweet, and leaning into the dry, leaning into the gin. To the point where you will find, and strangely enough, in my YouTube research, I almost exclusively found people calling a martini basically just straight gin or just straight vodka that they're shaking with ice and maybe putting an olive in. So we've leaned so dry today, I guess our modern taste, that we barely are using the vermouth and the ratios, which is why this dry wet category keeps getting skewed. Like, no, it's not dry until you have 5:1 or 10:1 or 15:1. Classically speaking, we're gonna call our wet, meaning sweet, meaning more vermouth, as a 1:1. That's gonna be our first experiment. The next experiment we're gonna do is a balanced dry. A little bit more dry, not too crazy. That's gonna be a 2:1. 2 parts gin to 1 part vermouth. A little bit more dry, a little bit less sweet. Now that doesn't mean 2 ounces to 1 ounce per se, although that would work out for this. It means 2 parts to 1 part. And maybe that will make more sense when we experiment with our classic dry or extra dry, which is gonna be 5:1. So we're not talking about 5 ounces to 1 ounce, it's 5 parts to 1 part. But we're gonna get into those measurements in a bit. This is all lane 1. We're experimenting with the different tastes of your wet to dry. Of course, you could take it a step further and bring vodka into the mix, but this is all gin, this is all stirred. I do recommend you experiment as much as you can with these because you will find your preferred taste of martini. And then when you go into a bar, you can specifically say gin martini, stirred, dry, 2:1 ratio, and the bartender will know exactly what you mean. Whoosh. Okay, we're gonna build this in the mixing glass, and generally you wanna aim for 3 ounces of total alcohol before dilution. So, ice in the mixing glass. Okay, for our wet martini, again, 1:1 ratio. So we're gonna have 1.5 ounce of each. And a quick word about the martini glass. There are some, I don't wanna say pretentious, but there are some bartenders that they won't even use martini glasses because it is quite difficult to yield, especially in a bar situation, and it is often difficult to drink as well. I really like it. It's low stress, at home bartenders, but you can definitely serve martinis in a Nick and Nora, in a coupe, in some kind of chilled coupe, but you do want to chill. These were chilled in the freezer overnight, but now they've been out for probably 7 to 10 minutes and they're already kinda defrosting. So ideally you take them out of the freezer, ready to go chilled. So, dry vermouth. Once again, vermouth is fortified wine. You do wanna refrigerate it after use it within a few weeks, and use a wine pumper to lengthen its life. 1.5 ounces of dry vermouth. I do recommend tasting every ingredient when you're first starting out so you can really appreciate it. This is sweet. We call it dry vermouth, but it does have a nice amount of sugar in it. I need a bigger bar. Okay. And 1.5 ounce of dry gin. We're gonna give that a mix. Whoosh. Julep strainer into your martini glass. express with a lemon peel, and discard. I should taste these all together, but oh, I really smell that lemon off the glass. I imagine most people are not into this much wet, this much sweet of the 1-to-1, but I do think this was more classically the drink as it was the original. It's a tad sweet. It's definitely not overly sweet, but the punch of the lemon really does help to balance out that sweet where it doesn't lean into sweet territory by any means. Okay, now our balanced dry. Fill our mixing glass with ice. And now we're doing 2-to-1. This is why I like having different jiggers for different purposes. This is very easy to measure 2-to-1. So I want to do 2 ounce gin, or 60 ml, and 1 ounce vermouth. So less sweet, less vermouth. We're gonna give that a stir. Good to practice our stirring. Julep strainer into a chilled martini glass or coupe. Express lemon peel on top. Discard. And I'm gonna save the taste test for the extra dry or classic dry, and that's gonna be 5-to-1. Now there's people that go all the way to 15-to-1, and famously Winston Churchill had a Churchill martini where he had the glass or the bottle of vermouth, and then he did his 2.5 or 3 ounces of gin and stirred while looking at the closed bottle. Okay, so that's as dry as you can get. 0 vermouth. So it gets crazy, but we're gonna do 5-to-1. So that is 2.5 ounces to 1/2 ounce. So 2.5 ounce of gin, 1/2 ounce of vermouth. Oh, that's way too much. Okay. All right, slow it down there. Slow it down there. 1/2 ounce. All right. That's gonna be less sweet, less wet. Give it a stir. Also notice I'm serving everything today up, meaning no ice in the glass. And what that means is it may get less cool over time, but it is not going to dilute in the glass. The exact flavor profile that we're pouring it out into the glass, it will stay that way. So here's our classic dry or extra dry. Again, folks will go drier, but I believe this was Difford's recommended dry martini ratio of 5-to-1. Everyone will recommend based on their own preference. Okay, express lemon on the top, discard. Let's do a taste. This is our balanced dry of 2-to-1. This feels much more balanced. Again, I wouldn't say the 1-to-1 was sweet, but it's a little bit less nuanced. It does, the 2-to-1 definitely has a nicer, I would say, rounder balance, for lack of a better word. That's what it is. It's just a bit more balanced. And here we have our extra dry, classic dry 5-to-1 ratio. Now we're getting into gin territory. And I would say at this stage, the gin becomes more important. Also, I do like what I like to call neutrality of a London Dry, but once you're going very gin heavy, you could also start to experiment with, different flavors of gin and just different types of gin, because at that point, it is very much a gin drink. Another quick thing to mention is that garnish for the dry leaning martini is often the olive, not just for the dirty martini, which we're gonna get to, but just the classic garnish, as the olive pairs well with the dry, whereas the lemon pairs well to balance out some of that sweet. I did lemon for all three, but I can see an olive, of course, pairing well with the drier variety. All right, speaking of dirty martini, this was lane 1. It's time for lane 2. Whoosh. Okay, lane 2. Lane 2, we are titling as seasoning, and dirty martini will fall into this category. I think the dirty martini is almost as prevalent as the regular martini, and there's a reason for that. I think the add-on of olive brine is not just an ingredient, it's seasoning. The fats of the olive and the acidity all help to actually season and round out the drink in a completely different way, leaning towards savory, and a lot of people like it. So let's give that a try. I'm gonna do 2 variations of a dirty martini. One we're gonna add olive brine, and one is called the chippy gibby, which ideally you would be adding onions that are fermented in a malt vinegar, which gives you that classic UK chips or French fries or freedom fries type of taste with that vinegar. I couldn't find malt vinegar, so I found this onion in apple cider vinegar, which is not gonna be as deep or rich as the malt vinegar. It'll lean a little bit more acid, but this is all experimental. So first the olive brine. Now that we've done lane 1, you should have your own preference. I actually liked the extra dry 5-to-1 ratio, but I'm not gonna lean that hard. I'm gonna go for a 3-to-1 ratio for the rest of the experiments to kind of build on my own preferred flavor profile and see what these other things add. So 3-to-1 ratio, we're gonna simplify, and I'm gonna do 2 ounces of gin and 3/4 ounce of vermouth. Ice in the mixing glass. Okay, 2 ounce gin, 3/4 ounce vermouth. I got these really nice homemade-esque olives from a local store, and as with everything in the martini, there is a gamut of agreed upon ratios for the olive brine. It could be anywhere from a bar spoon to a full ounce. I'm gonna go with a 1/2 ounce for this one. So 1/2 ounce of olive brine, which I feel like is more than enough. I feel like that's a good amount. We're gonna give that a stir. Whoosh. Into a chilled martini glass or coupe. Look at that, dirty. That is dirty. Of course, that is garnished with olives. And we're gonna make one more. You always wanna use fresh ice, by the way, in between each drink, because it's gonna be just diluted and watered down. You want good, fresh, dry ice for each build. So, 2 ounces of gin. I think I used almost a whole bottle of gin on this episode. 3/4 ounce of vermouth. We're gonna give that a mix. You know you're mixing well when it's quiet. Listen to how quiet that is. All this mixing is good practice for me. Whoosh. See how much cleaner that is without the brine. And now we're gonna add our chippy gibby, kinda chippy gibby. Again, this is onion in apple cider. All right, so I'm gonna take a spoon. Just drop that in. Also try and get a couple of drops in there. And here we have our lane 2 seasoning. The dirty and the chippy. Okay, I like olives, but I think that is half an ounce was too much. I think you can always add more. So I would actually opt for 10 to 20 ounces, maybe a bar spoon at first. Maybe the garnish, these are pretty serious olives. Maybe the garnish was also kind of adding into it. Maybe you like a half an ounce, but I would recommend starting low because this tastes like olive juice and building it up. But it is good, actually. It is good. And now I'm a little bit nervous about this one, but Chippy Gibby, not really Chippy Gibby, apple cider, onion, dirty. I don't know if this was just very strong, but I'm not really getting it. Let me add some more. You only live once, right? Let's see. Yeah, that is interesting. That's not bad at all, surprisingly. I'm very curious to get a more vinegary type of, malt vinegar, proper Chippy Gibby. I'm gonna keep on the lookout for onions, or you can make it yourself as well by fermenting onions in a malt vinegar. These are really fun, really interesting. And of course, as always, this could be your baseline and you can really have fun with it and see what intersection tickles your fancy the most. Variations specifically for this lane 2 variety of seasoning. I mean, there's olive, of course. There's also pickle juice, which, similar to the apple cider vinegar, is going to lean sour and acidic as opposed to vinegar, but you can also lean towards umami. And you can do this very easily by getting MSG powder and dropping a little bit of MSG powder or diluting the MSG into water first and adding that in. That would be a very interesting experiment because I think that would round out a lot more than something sharp like pickle juice. And I happen to have kimchi in my fridge and I thought I would just put that out there. I could see a kimchi martini really jiving in this same kind of thought process of seasoning. Lane 2. Lane 3. Whoosh. Lane 3 I'm not gonna build because I wasn't able to get sake before this recording. But lane 3, the essence is essentially a replacement. Essentially, you would replace the vermouth with another spirit or liqueur. In this case, sake. I'm gonna read a description of what that may taste like because I don't have it in front of me. But essentially, vermouth is in place for a very specific balance counterpart, like much of what we've done in Gin Month. But sake has a much more subtle roundness, which would maybe take us a bit more of a step back in the balance and give a different mouthfeel. You could also replace your vermouth with a dry sherry, a Lillet Blanc, and like all variations, treat it like a template. You're gonna get an entirely different drink. I think the sake-tini sounds cool and would be a very interesting drink to try. Whoosh. Okay, lane 4, our last lane. This is aroma. I was gonna build 2 different drinks, but I can already see one is, well, not failed, but not worth building, but I'll mention why. Okay, so we're gonna do 2 concepts here. One is a rinse, a Scotch rinse. So we have a very smoky Scotch. I highly recommend Laphroaig, both because I happen to love it. If you're not a fan of peaty or smoky Scotch, you may want to skip this entirely. But 2, it is on the cheaper side of peaty Scotches. And interestingly, I actually like the cheaper Laphroaig more than the more expensive varieties because it has that punch. It has much more of a peaty punch, but we're not really drinking it. We're more vibing it. So how do we do that? Well, you can pour it in your glass a little bit, give it a rinse, and then chuck it out, and then the film kind of remains specifically for the aroma. Or if you have what's called an atomizer, which is just a fancy word for a spray. Here I have a nice classic looking one for video purposes. So that's what I'm gonna do. Before recording, I filled up my atomizer with some Laphroaig, and we're just gonna spray. Oh yeah. And then we're gonna build our preferred Martini ratio. We're gonna give that a stir. And by the way, in the same vein, although I wouldn't do I would maybe do is to have a smoker and just smoke out the glass first, which is very similar. Julep strainer our Martini into our atomized, smoky, chilled Martini glass or coupe. The other build that I was gonna do, which I've prepared in advance, are burnt olives. I made this by putting it in a sandwich maker. I suppose you could put it on an actual grill. I think I need to experiment with it a little bit more. But the reason I'm not building it is because it was meant to be just a garnish, but they don't have a very strong smell. I don't think they would be adding that much as just a garnish. Maybe if they were charred with a proper torch or somehow actually burnt, and maybe if they were built in the mixing glass or even muddled, I think that would really express a bit more of that burnt aroma. But these as is was a fun experiment, but I don't think it's quite there. So those are the two ideas. We're going to taste the atomized Laphroaig. Very important to smell the glass. We're definitely getting wafts of that charred vibe of the Laphroaig. It is really interesting. I mean, this is a very good experiment to see really how much aroma comes into play when drinking or eating. And that's a very big part of taste. That is why we garnish cocktails mostly, is the aroma as you take it in really completely changes the makeup of the taste as your brain perceives it. That is really fun. I could see that pairing well with some of the other ideas and lanes that we did as well. I do think a smoked glass with a smoker would also work really well, and perhaps that could pair simultaneously with the burnt olives, although maybe I would separate it just for our own experimentation. And that'll do it for this very off the rails last week of Gin Month. I think a really good conclusion for all of this chaos is there is no right way to make a martini. Of course, there's no right way to make any cocktail, but a martini is a very fun experimental base that you could form your own strong opinions on and rant and rave on Reddit like the rest of them. But in the meantime, it's really fun to just experiment at home, find your preferred ratio, makeup, build, garnish. And I think it's also a fun way to express to friends and guests all these different variations of fun ways to build the martini. That's gonna do it for Gin Month. I hope you enjoy, experiment, and build. Next week, we start Vodka Month. So until then, as always, happy mixing.